Hello everybody! In my last video I talked about the European Union and I was criticized for not mentioning Frontex. So that's what we're doing here. If you're American, you may not know what Frontex is at all. Very basically, it's an agency of the European Union that is tasked with securing the Schengen area borders. The Schengen area is of course the area where you can travel freely from country to country without any border checks. So countries like Germany and Austria rely on other countries to secure their borders. That is why there's an EU-funded agency to do that job. I called it an agency and that's its actual name. The EU has task forces called agencies, like the Fundamental Rights Agency, which is seated in Vienna. There are over 40 agencies seated all over Europe. Frontex, which we will discuss today, is seated in Warsaw and is officially called the European Border and Coast Guard Agency. You may wonder why I didn't mention agencies in my EU video. The answer is simple. All 40 plus agencies make up less than 1% of the EU budget, so they felt pretty minor. Though that percent can change as Frontex keeps getting more and more money every year. When I started researching, I wondered who agencies work for. I just learned the entire structure of the EU government, so I wanted to know. Was it Parliament, the European Council, the Council of the European Union, the Commission? It was the Commission. Remember, the Commission is the executive, so of course they run the border guards. In this video I will go over what Frontex is meant to do and how they present themselves. Then we will refresh our minds about what exactly the relevant refugee and immigrant rights are, and then we will look at how Frontex deliberately sabotages and undermines every one of these rights and how they are getting away with it. Which, learning why Frontex gets away with this, was easily the most shocking thing in political reality I've heard about since the collapse of the USSR. If that sounds exciting or at least interesting, please stay tuned while I thank my Patreons. I am incredibly glad to have the support of generous and supportive people like you, especially because I'm in sort of a bad spot right now and I can't make nearly as many videos as normally, which sadly means I don't know when I will upload again, but thank you for supporting me anyways. It's hard to express how much it means, and I'm sure you're excited to hear about Frontex, so let's get back to the video topic. So, what even is Frontex? It's an EU agency, we already know that, but how does it work? Is it like ICE in the United States? Do they stand around the border searching vehicles for drugs, guns and illegal immigrants? I would forgive you for thinking so, because if you watch any media Frontex uploaded to their YouTube channel or read any official statement from Frontex, you will get the feeling that they are a police force. They are not. They're actually advisors with no real field agents. What happens is that if there are many immigrants or refugees at one spot for some reason, like for example lots of Ukrainians entering into Slovakia for a mysterious reason, that might overwhelm the Slovakian border agencies. You see, in the EU, each country on the perimeter of the Schengen area controls their own borders. But if they are overwhelmed, then Frontex will step in. Frontex then offers things like extra equipment for the border agency. They can also train more people to become border agents, and if it's really bad, they can coordinate the border guards of other EU countries to protect the border of Slovakia. As of now, Frontex is a purely advisory body, at least when it comes to land operations. But things are different when it comes to the sea. Frontex has its own vessels for patrolling the Mediterranean Sea. They work with Greece, Spain and Italy for that purpose. Frontex says that they need these boats to stop human trafficking, gun smuggling and illegal immigration. Also, a lot of people who like Frontex's YouTube channel, say that Frontex is there to rescue immigrants. They have an entire video on how Frontex is saving illegal immigrant children from sex trafficking by permanently separating them from the adults they travel with.
This is the first authority in the EU that sees children when they come, and that is actually in a very good position to take the child out of this chain of crime and get them into a protection system.
You probably also know that there are people who get into tiny boats to cross the Mediterranean, which shows that they must be really desperate. So often those boats are filled way past capacity to transport as many desperate people at once, which is dangerous. Boats can capsize or be swamped by big waves. Of course, the reason people expose themselves to that danger is because they are fleeing from war zones like Libya and Syria. Better risk drowning than being executed by some warlord. And these boats filled with desperate refugees often get into trouble. The Mediterranean is not exactly a lake. And Frontex says that they rescue people who get into trouble in the Mediterranean. It's one of their stated purposes, and everyone who defends Frontex says that this is why it's great. It rescues people at sea. Damn, I sure hope that Frontex's mission to patrol the Mediterranean is actually good and doesn't show up in the section of Frontex human rights violations. Just kidding, of course it does. Frontex is fucked up and everybody who says it does good is either misinformed or lying. Frontex also operates some aircraft for surveillance of land and sea borders, but they don't do many important jobs. In theory, they can watch people at illegal border crossings, but pretty much every single refugee coming to Europe uses legal border crossings. I said that Frontex has no field officers and only does advisory jobs. This is true now, but it is changing. Frontex is hiring a lot of new people. Within 5 years, they plan to employ 30,000 border guards, 10,000 of which would be armed. They would be working for the EU itself and not the country they operate in. They would likewise be sent to places with a strong influx of immigration, providing more manpower and equipment to temporarily assist. And on top of that, Frontex would take over internal operations. This means that they would drive across Europe in cars like this one and try to track people down who they consider illegal. This already sounds a bit fucked up, but this one gets even worse in the human rights violations section. Now, you may think that Frontex may be an important organization when it comes to checking borders. Personally, I don't think borders are needed in a society with so much police pressure, but I understand that you may think that border guards are good. And if you think that, you probably think it makes sense to have an organization that can support them when there is random influx of people. And that makes sense if there was such a huge entrance of refugees. So let's check how many there were in the last report. Over the last 3 months, there were a total of 40,000 illegal border crossings, dispersed on all EU nations. That's it. And that is a report that Frontex made, so it may be exaggerated. All of those 40,000 people will be hunted down and deported by Frontex. And now I ask you, is that good? Is it that important to track these people down? They just want better lives in Europe. And in total, all the immigration is like 6,000 people a year per country. Germany alone in 2018 saw 1.5 million immigrants and refugees. Those labelled illegal would make practically no difference at all. Frontex is paid over 700 million euro a year to deal with so few people that it seems scarcely worth it. Though I respect you if you have a different view, but I invite you to wait for the human rights violations section before commenting. But of course, before looking at that, let's look at the human rights those people who cross the border have. Broadly, there are 3 types of people who cross the border. Refugees who flee from the country they came from because of war or unjust persecution. They're an internationally and legally recognized group and as such have the most legal protections. For example, if they flee to a country, they receive all the freedom to work, to move, to access education and more. For all intents and purposes, refugees are treated like citizens in the country they arrive in. An example of refugees right now is Ukrainians. People flee from the war, the violence and destruction, and they are currently taken in by the EU as refugees. Note that refugees are not on the 40,000 border crossings number we saw here. About 4 million Ukrainians fled to the EU just since the wars started 2 months ago. The next group is migrants. A migrant is someone who leaves their country of birth to live somewhere else. Because Europe is very wealthy and Africa and parts of Asia are very much not that, a lot of people want to migrate to the EU to better their lives. Unfortunately, the EU doesn't like migrants, so you can only migrate if you are part of one of these groups here. You need a really good education. You need to be working for a company with an EU seat. You need to be a researcher, only stay for a few weeks, or be a student or someone temporarily staying for training. Well, if you don't fit any of these categories, if you're low skilled or disabled, well, fuck you, you can't come to the EU at all ever. And that is how we get to the third group, illegal immigrants. Those are people who try to migrate to the EU but do not fulfill the visa requirements. They are likewise people trying to get better lives, but EU citizens have an irrational hatred towards them. The most common way for illegal immigration is to go to a holiday in Europe and then just stay. A forged passport makes that easier. Of course, there are people at border crossings or getting in other ways as well. A lot of people travel with boats to European land. Interestingly, many make these journeys by boat as refugees, not illegal immigrants, because they actually flee persecution. But to be a refugee, you need to be on the territory of the nation you're fleeing to. So people take boats to get into the national waters of these countries so they can get refugee status. You may wonder how the Coast Guard can tell what people in boats are illegals and which of them are refugees. Easy, they can't. So they log everyone in these boats as illegals. Half of this map here is filled with people who were probably refugees and not illegals at all. Yes, they're lying about the amount of people coming in to get more funding. What did you expect? Speaking about refugees on boats, there are a lot of rights people get at sea. For example, if a ship or boat is sinking, other vessels are required to assist them and rescue them. So if a boat filled with people sinks, any ship nearby must take them in. It's international law. So if a refugee boat sinks, the Coast Guard is responsible for picking them up. What happens next? Basically, the next port the ship goes to is responsible for the refugees. This is why I can often see nations playing hot potato with rescue ships. Oh, you can't get in port here. Oh, you can't be there either. Also, they don't have to take refugees in. Interestingly, if a boat is, for example, in Libyan waters, it's Libya who has to rescue them. And if it's in Italian waters, the Italians must rescue. So in theory, all you would have to do to prevent refugees from entering Europe would be to give the warring factions in the civil war speedboats and money and tell them to rescue the people on the boats. But those people would be factions in the civil war, the very factions the people are fleeing from. It would be an absolute human rights violation to fund Libyan rebels so they can arrest those fleeing from the rebels. Guess what? Frontex funds Libyan rebels so they can arrest those fleeing from the rebels. And that is even more fucked up because the Human Rights Court of the European Union ruled that nobody can deport people to Libya because of the threat of, quote, torture and death. And what happens to these people? Well, a lot of them just disappear and are never heard from again. It's a war zone, so that is possible, but again, the only reason they're in the war zone is because Frontex didn't take them in, but instead called the Libyan warlords, which again violates what the European Court of Human Rights ruled. Of course, if the refugees get out of Libyan waters, then Frontex can't call someone else to deal with the refugees. So they're legally required by the law of the sea to help. So Frontex just stopped patrolling the Mediterranean with boats. Instead, they send unmanned drones, which are not required to help. So Frontex is actively reducing their ability to help those in need because they're scared of refugees coming in. Frontex ships have been observed deliberately putting refugee boats off their course by passing them at full speed. So the wake of the ship pushes the boats back to Turkey. Of course, the boats could capsize or collide with the ship, but apparently Frontex is not concerned with that. There was also a whole case where multiple NGOs sued Frontex last year because of, well, I just quote the NGO's statements. The case was filed on behalf of 2 asylum seekers who, while seeking asylum on EU soil in Lesbos, were violently rounded up, assaulted, robbed, abducted, detained, forcibly transferred back to the sea, collectively expelled and ultimately abandoned on rafts with no means of navigation, food or water. The legal process is still ongoing at the time of recording. In addition to all of their questionable work in the Mediterranean, Frontex also checks people at airports. So if you're a foreigner entering into the Schengen area, Frontex will immediately assume that you are a threat and you have fake papers. Something else they may expect is that any children traveling with you are not your children. You see, Frontex made this YouTube video in which they explain that sometimes children are trafficked into for the sex trade. There's little evidence that such a thing really exists, but I get the fear. How does Frontex deal with it? As said before, they separate children from the adults they travel with permanently. Frontex is also working in internal tasks now. This means they patrol inside of the EU trying to track down who they consider illegal, which, as a reminder, Frontex is not great at distinguishing migrants, refugees and illegal migrants, and all treats them like illegals. So if you migrate to the EU, Frontex may show up at your house with a vehicle like this and ask you a whole bunch of questions to get rid of you. And of course, Frontex straight up lies. A Syrian family reached an island on Greece and got refugee status. This means that they have all the rights of the citizens. And see above, one of those rights is the freedom to move. And they can't get deported either. Except Frontex does not care. They put the family in a plane and told them the plane goes to the EU mainland. It in fact flew to Turkey. They were in the country they had fled through. This violates about 1 billion laws and likely happens way more often. We just don't always see it reported on TV. But hey, Frontex surely has some way to complain, right? And if you watch their YouTube channel, they say they do. They have a complaint mechanism you can write to. Issue is that this is enforced by Frontex. They're investigating their own complaints. Not a surprise that nothing ever comes of it. And here comes the bombshell, the big shock of the video and the one thing you need to remember no matter what. Frontex is outside of the law. Yeah, that is right. Because they're an agency of the EU and not of a country, they are only accountable to the High Court of Europe. And that court only deals with EU laws. And the EU has no laws against murder or discrimination or immigrant rights. That is why they can push away migrant boats instead of saving them. The EU has never signed any treaties on refugee rights. The member states did, but Frontex is not bound to that because they don't work for the member states. So in international waters, they can do anything, like call Libyan warlords to get rid of refugees. Of course, if Frontex officers are operating within a member state, they need to follow the laws of that state, just like everyone who lives there. This is why we know about the Syrian family that was sent to Turkey, because they made it back to Greece and sued the responsible Frontex personnel under Greek law. I said Frontex needs to follow EU law, but they don't. The EU said they need to establish a human rights department with at least 40 officers examining human rights violations in Frontex. They just didn't do it. They had 3 years to do it and just didn't. What are you gonna do? Drag them in front of the European High Court? On top of that, as I said, Frontex is changing right now to more field operations, for which they ordered vehicles like this. That's an armored personnel carrier used in war zones. That pretty much tells you what Frontex think its task is. They also got new uniforms which look like this, and you can see it's black. Personally, as someone from a German-speaking country, the color black plus unaccountable government agencies sounds like a repeat of history, just a tiny bit. So, ultimately, we have an organization filled with human rights violations which cannot be held accountable, not by the voters, not even by the European institution that it made it. It engages in a lot of illegal activity, among others supporting warlords in Libya. They truly are the Stasi of Europe. If you don't know what the Stasi is, that is fair. It was the secret service in East Germany. They were likewise accused of human rights violations and were above the law. The only difference is that the Stasi kept people in, while Frontex keeps people out. Now I'm at the part of the video in which I begin my hopeful paragraph of how the situation can be fixed. It can't be. Frontex would need to be fully abolished in my mind. Maybe you think immigrant control is good because it stops those lazy refugees who live on welfare and take your jobs. But here's some math. Frontex has a budget of €754 million. If trends from the first quarter of 2020 continue, which is unlikely, there will be 160,000 illegals in Europe. You could literally give every illegal immigrant €4,500 every year if the EU gave the money to people instead of using it to keep them away. Oh, and the budget of Frontex is supposed to be increased by a factor of 4 by 2027. Not to mention those 160,000 distributed on 28 Schengen countries would only make about 5,000 people a year per country. And yes, I completely ignored the human angle and it's just used math. But remember, this is one of the richest continents on Earth. We can't provide for immigrants, we can't afford it. So Why, instead of helping them, did we build an organization above the law that violates the rights and dignities of those moving to Europe? Is that what European values are? Thank you for watching. After this one, I don't know when I'll upload again, because I'm going for a psych ward for about 9 weeks. Keep an eye on Wiki 2000, I may do a vlog. Thank you very much for your support through the years, and especially thanks to Autumn Keasley, Tehun Hartley, Alan Vo, Eric Betts, V, Xander Corbus, Tusnek, Attila Nemitz, Carissa, Comrade Falcon, Daniel Hyman, Dominic Coroselli, Emily Margaret Klassen, Evie Wren, Herdina, Ian Snyder, Kevin Sanders, Glastrup, Lazy Panda 234, Liam S, Mabuka Tiliari, Marxism Tonight, Nana Epema, Nathan Neatman, Poet, Ramondeville, Red Shock Trooper, Sean Murphy, Stairmaster Chef, Theo and Julia Jr. and Trey. Love you all. Oh, meet the people behind Frontex? I would love to meet them. Give me their full legal name and address, please.